They were already laughing at her when the stagecoach door swung open and the silent mail-order bride stepped down into the dust, clutching her small carpet bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright, her breath tight and trembling as the ranch hands exchanged smirks and elbowed each other, saying loud enough for the entire depot to hear, "He ordered a wife, not a broken doll." And, "Does she even talk? Or did the coach driver forget to wind her up?" Sarah flinched at the cruelty, but made no sound. Not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. Her voice long ago trapped behind walls sealed by fear and bruises no one in this town knew existed. And when she lifted her eyes toward the man who was supposed to be her groom, rancher Eli Barrett, she found not warmth, not welcome, but disappointment so sharp it knocked the breath from her chest. "That's her?" Eli said to his men, not bothering to lower his voice. "A wife who can't even speak?" The men burst into laughter. Sarah's cheeks burned as she signed a shaky greeting, hoping he might understand the effort. But Eli scoffed and waved her off. "I asked for a partner, not a burden," he snapped. "Send her back on the next coach." Sarah shook her head frantically, signing again, "Please, I came all this way, please!" But her hands only made them laugh harder. One boy snatched her carpet bag and dumped it upside down, scattering her belongings in the dirt. Her ribbon, her folded dress, the tiny locket she kept close because it was the last thing her mother touched before dying. "Maybe she'll scream if we throw enough dust at her," another mocked, kicking sand toward her face. Sarah stumbled back, knees buckling, her fingers flying desperately as if signing fast enough might somehow replace her voice. But the more she tried, the harder they mocked her, circling like coyotes around a wounded deer. Eli crossed his arms. "I'm not marrying someone who can't speak a word," he said coldly. "Take her away." That was when the ground seemed to shift, when the crowd parted as a giant Apache warrior stepped forward with a slow, deliberate stride, each thundering step carrying a warning that made the laughter choke out of the ranch hands' throats. He towered over everyone, braids resting against broad shoulders, eyes burning like embers ready to ignite. He stopped beside Sarah, his shadow falling over her like a wall of protection she didn't understand. His voice rumbled low and dangerous as he glared at Eli. "You mock a woman for silence," he growled, "yet your own words reveal the true coward." Eli stiffened. "This ain't your business." The Apache warrior stepped closer. "It is now." Then he knelt beside Sarah, gathering her scattered belongings with surprising gentleness, lifting her locket from the dust like it was something sacred. When he placed it in her shaking hands, their eyes met. And he said the words that silenced the entire depot. "If he rejects you, then walk with me instead." For a moment Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move, because no one, not her groom, not the ranch hands, not the townsfolk, had ever knelt beside her with anything resembling gentleness, and the Apache warrior's hand hovered in the air between them, steady and open, waiting for her to choose it rather than commanding her to take it. The ranch hands stared in stunned silence, Eli's face turning red with humiliation as he barked, "She ain't walking with nobody! She's going back on the coach where she came from!" And he reached to grab Sarah's arm, but the warrior rose in one smooth, towering movement and intercepted him with a single step that forced Eli backward, like he'd run into a wall. "Do not touch her," the warrior warned, voice low and lethal. "You forfeited that right the moment you shamed her." Eli scoffed, trying to rally the men around him. "She can't talk. She can't even answer a question. What good is she?" Sarah felt the words like blows, but before she could shrink back, the warrior's chest expanded with a slow, sharp inhale as he spoke clearly enough for the entire depot to hear. "A woman who has survived in silence is stronger than any man who speaks with cruelty." The crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring wide-eyed at the confrontation. Sarah's trembling fingers lifted, forming the clumsy sign for thank you. But she doubted he understood. Her hands moved too fast, too uneven, shaped by fear instead of clarity. But his eyes followed every motion with surprising focus, softening as if he understood the meaning even if he didn't know the language. Eli gestured wildly. "You're defending something broken!" Sarah flinched as if struck. The Apache warrior turned his head just enough for Eli to see the burning fury in his eyes. "She is not broken," he said, each word a dark promise. "She is wounded. Wounds can heal. Cowardice cannot." One of the ranch hands muttered, "Careful, Eli. He'll rip your head clean off." But Eli, too proud to back down, spat in the warrior's direction. "Take her then," he shouted. "You want a useless bride? She's right there." Sarah gasped, her eyes filling with tears she fought to hold back, because if the warrior regretted stepping in now, she wouldn't survive the shame. But he didn't hesitate. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Little one," he murmured, "I do not take you. You choose me." Her breath shook, her hands lifted again, forming her name in a trembling sign. The warrior's lips parted slightly as if in quiet recognition. "Sarah," he repeated carefully, pronouncing it with reverence instead of mockery. Sarah nodded, tears slipping. And when he extended his hand again, large, warm, steady, something inside her fragile chest dared to reach back. She placed her trembling fingers into his palm, the first voluntary touch she had offered another human in years. The warrior closed his hand around hers with a firmness that did not trap but supported, anchoring her like a lifeline. Gasps echoed through the depot as he said, loud enough for Eli to hear clearly. "She walks with me now." Sarah's fingers tightened around the Apache warrior's hand as he guided her away from the depot, his stride slow enough that she didn't have to stumble to keep up. But her heart pounded with a confusing mix of terror and relief. Terror because she had never walked beside a man who defended her, and relief because for the first time in years she wasn't walking alone. Behind them, Eli sputtered curses, the ranch hands whispering among themselves, but none dared follow, not with the giant warrior throwing one last warning glance over his shoulder that made even the boldest men step back. Sarah kept her head lowered, ashamed of the attention, ashamed of the tears drying on her cheeks, ashamed of the way her silence made her look helpless. But the warrior, still holding her hand gently despite his size, tilted his head slightly and asked in a low voice, "Do you fear me?" She shook her head immediately. Not once since he stepped forward had she felt fear of him. Fear of the world, yes. Fear of Eli, yes, but not this man. She signed clumsily, "Thank you," her fingers shaky from nerves, and though her motions were imperfect, he watched them with the patience of someone reading a sacred text. "I am Red Hawk," he said, touching his chest, "warrior of the White Mesa Band." She touched her own chest, Sarah, and he nodded as if he already knew. They walked a few more steps before the wind tugged at her sleeve, pulling it high enough to expose the purpling mark stretching from her elbow to mid-forearm. A handprint bruise so distinct, it might as well have been a confession burned into her skin. Red Hawk stopped so abruptly she nearly collided with him. His eyes darkened, jaw tightening as he lifted her arm, not forcefully, but with a careful reverence, as if her bruises might crumble beneath a rough touch. "Who did this?" he asked, voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. Sarah panicked, pulling her arm back, shaking her head rapidly. No, her hands flying in frantic signs he couldn't possibly follow. She signed, "It's over. I'm fine." "Don't worry." But her hands trembled so violently the lie bled through every motion. Red Hawk exhaled slowly, trying to contain the storm inside him as he knelt so he could look her in the eyes. "Someone hurt you," he said softly. "Someone who wanted your voice quiet. Someone who wanted you afraid." Her breath caught. She looked away, hugging herself. He lowered his head. "Sarah," he murmured, "I do not need your voice to know your truth." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't want him to see. But he did. Gently, he reached out, brushing a single tear from her cheek with the back of his knuckle. "A man who bruised you left a mark on your skin," he said, voice breaking with quiet fury. "But the men who laughed today tried to bruise your spirit. I will not let either continue." She shook her head. "I don't want trouble," she tried to sign, but Red Hawk stopped her hands, covering them with his own. "You are not trouble," he whispered. "You are a woman who has survived too much alone." Sarah's breath trembled. Red Hawk rose, placing himself between her and the town behind them. "Walk with me," he said, "not as someone rescued, but as someone who deserves protection until she can stand without fear." And for the first time, Sarah realized he didn't see her silence as weakness. He saw it as a wound worth guarding. Red Hawk guided Sarah toward the edge of town with the same unwavering steadiness he'd shown since the moment he stepped between her and Eli. His large hand wrapped around hers not to claim or control, but to anchor her trembling steps. Yet every few paces, Sarah glanced over her shoulder, fear tightening her breath because she knew bruises didn't appear on their own. Someone had put them there, someone who didn't think she deserved a voice, someone who would be furious she'd dared to leave. Red Hawk noticed every flinch, every stiffening of her spine, every time her fingers tightened in silent panic, and his jaw hardened as he realized the danger wasn't over simply because he'd defended her in public. "You look behind you too often," he murmured, voice low. "Who follows your shadow?" Sarah shook her head rapidly. "No one, no one," she signed in frantic motions, but he had already seen the truth hidden in the tremble of her hands. "Someone hurt you," he repeated, "and someone believes he has the right to again." Her breath hitched, tears stinging her lashes, but before she could form another sign, movement flickered at the far end of the dusty street. A tall, broad figure striding out of the saloon with rage written across the slope of his shoulders. Sarah froze. Red Hawk followed her stare. The man saw them, and he smiled. It was not a kind smile, not a shy one, but the smile of a man who believed the woman he'd bruised still belonged under his boot. He marched toward them, swaggering with the entitlement of someone who thought the world owed him obedience. "There you are," he barked, shouting loud enough for the entire street to turn. "Girl, get over here, now!" Sarah stumbled backward, shaking her head, her signs frantic and choppy. "No, no, please, no!" But the man only sneered. "You've got chores left, and you owe me rent. Get your useless self back inside, or I'll—" He reached for her arm. Red Hawk stepped in front of her so fast the man's hand smashed into the warrior's chest instead, fingers bouncing off solid muscle as if hitting stone. The man blinked, then scowled, puffing up as he spat. "Back off. She's mine. She works for me, eats my food, sleeps under my roof. I decide where she stands." Red Hawk didn't blink, didn't move, didn't even lift a hand. He simply said, with a deadly calm that made the man falter, "She sleeps in a shed." The man hesitated. "That's her choice." "She sleeps on dirt," Red Hawk continued, his voice sharpening. "She sleeps with fear, with bruises, with silence you beat into her." Sarah choked on a sob she hadn't meant to release. The man's face twisted. "You calling me a liar, Apache?" "I am calling you exactly what you are," Red Hawk said, taking one step forward that forced the man back. "A coward who hurts women who cannot scream." The man's hand twitched toward the knife tucked in his belt. Sarah moved automatically, stepping between them in blind panic. "No, please, stop, stop." But Red Hawk gently pushed her behind him again, placing his own body between her and danger without hesitation. The man sneered. "She's my property." Red Hawk's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. "She is under my protection." The man reached again. Red Hawk caught his wrist mid-air with one hand. The man gasped, and the entire town watched as Red Hawk bent the man's arm slowly, patiently, until the crack echoed like a breaking branch. Sarah covered her mouth, trembling violently, not scared of Red Hawk, but scared by how far this man had pushed everything. Red Hawk released him, letting him collapse into the dirt. "If you ever touch her again," he growled, "you will not leave standing." Sarah's knees buckled, tears blurring the world. And Red Hawk caught her, not as something fragile, not as a burden, but as someone finally worth protecting. Red Hawk didn't spare another glance for the man groaning in the dirt, clutching his twisted wrist and cursing through clenched teeth. Instead, he wrapped one arm around Sarah's shoulders, steadying her trembling body as gently as if she were made of glass, guiding her away from the gathering crowd whose whispers chased them like ghosts. "Did you see that? He broke him like a twig. Poor girl, she's trembling. He defended her like she was his own." But Red Hawk ignored every voice except the uneven rise and fall of Sarah's breath as he led her toward the open plains where the sharp edges of town could no longer reach her. Her steps were small, uneven, like someone who had learned to move quietly to avoid being noticed, and though she kept wiping her tears with shaky fingers, they kept returning, hot and helpless, not from fear of Red Hawk, but from the unbearable release of years of holding everything inside. When she tried to sign, "I'm sorry," her hands shook so violently the motions fell apart halfway through, but Red Hawk caught them gently, his large palms engulfing hers. "Do not apologize," he murmured, his deep voice soft enough to steady the storm inside her. "Your pain is not a burden. Your silence is not a flaw. The shame belongs to the man who hurt you, not to you." Sarah closed her eyes, breath trembling, because no one had ever said words like that to her. Red Hawk guided her off the road, down the narrow deer path leading toward the cottonwood grove near the river. She tugged at his hand hesitantly, signing, "Where are we going?" Small, timid motions he watched with careful attention. "To safety," he said simply. "My people camp by the river tonight. No one will touch you there." Panic flared in her eyes. She began frantically signing, "No trouble, no trouble. Please, they won't want me." "I don't belong anywhere," but Red Hawk placed a gentle hand on her wrist, grounding her. "You are not trouble," he said calmly. "And belonging is not something other people grant. It is something you give yourself." Her lips parted in a silent gasp. No one had ever spoken to her like she had worth. As they neared the grove, the sound of crackling fire and soft voices drifted through the trees. Red Hawk paused at the edge of the clearing, turning to face her. "Sarah," he said, lowering his head so she didn't have to look up so far. "You will not sleep alone tonight, not in fear, not in darkness. My sister will stay with you. You have my word." Her breath hitched, her eyes filling again, not with terror this time, but with something unsteady and unfamiliar. Hope. When she signed, "Why?" Her fingers tiny and uncertain, Red Hawk studied her for a long moment, his eyes softening. "Because someone should have protected you long ago," he said quietly. "And because when I first saw you in that dust, small, silent, hurting, I felt the world telling me you could not keep carrying your silence alone." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening. And as Red Hawk gently guided her into the fire-lit circle of his people, a place where she expected rejection but received curious, gentle gazes instead, she realized this was the first night she would not have to run. Not from footsteps, not from shouts, not from the man who bruised her, because a warrior had stepped forward, and she wasn't facing the world alone anymore. Sarah clung to Red Hawk's hand as he guided her into the firelit clearing, her heart thundering with the terror of being seen, really seen, by strangers who might judge her silence, her timid posture, her shaking hands. But instead of mockery or suspicion, she found the Apache camp turning toward her with a quiet curiosity, their gazes soft rather than sharp, their voices gentle rather than scornful. Children peeked from behind woven blankets, women paused in their work of grinding maize or tending fires, warriors lifted their eyes from sharpening blades, yet none moved toward her with hostility, none whispered cruel gossip, none narrowed their eyes the way the townsfolk always did. Red Hawk's sister, Dawn Willow, rose from beside a low fire, her long braids swinging as she approached with a welcoming smile that immediately eased some of the tightness in Sarah's chest. "Brother," she greeted Red Hawk, then turned her warm, assessing gaze to Sarah. "Is she the one you spoke of?" Sarah's breath caught. He had spoken of her? Carefully, Red Hawk nodded. "She is hurt," he said quietly. "She carries more than her hands can hold." Dawn Willow's expression softened entirely. She stepped closer, but slowly, giving Sarah time to step back if she wished. Sarah froze, her fingers twitching, unsure whether to hide or greet or run. But Dawn Willow reached out and gently cupped Sarah's cheek, her palm warm, steady, protective in a way Sarah hadn't felt since childhood. "Welcome, sister," she said simply. Sister. The word hit Sarah like a blow, not painful but overwhelming. She tried to sign thank you, but her hands shook too badly, the motions half-formed, collapsing before they reached meaning. Dawn Willow didn't mind. She clasped Sarah's trembling hands between her own. "Your voice is here," she whispered, tapping Sarah's heart. "Not only here." She tapped her throat. Sarah's eyes filled, tears blurring the firelight. Red Hawk watched the exchange, something fierce and tender tightening his expression as Dawn Willow led Sarah toward a small lodge at the far edge of the clearing. Inside, woven mats covered the ground, and blankets dyed in warm colors hung along the walls. A young girl shaped a clay pot by the fire and looked up shyly when they entered. "This is Fawn," Dawn Willow said. "She knows silence. She will stay with you tonight." Fawn offered Sarah a small, warm smile. The smile of someone who understood what it meant to live in quietness, not by choice, but by circumstance. Sarah sank to her knees, overwhelmed, touching her chest as she signed her name. Fawn nodded in understanding and signed safe back. Safe. The word made Sarah's breath shake loose inside her chest. Dawn Willow draped a thick blanket around her shoulders and said, "Eat. Rest. No one touches you here." When Dawn Willow stepped outside, Sarah peeked through the flap in time to see Red Hawk take a place near the entrance, his back straight, his spear resting beside him, his gaze sweeping the darkness like a sentinel who had claimed a duty he had no intention of abandoning. For the first time in her life, Sarah fell asleep knowing someone outside was watching over her, not to control her, not to punish her, but to protect her. And that knowledge wrapped around her more tightly than any blanket ever could. Sarah woke to the soft glow of dawn seeping through the lodge walls, her body still heavy from the deepest sleep she'd had in years, but the warmth of safety shattered the instant she heard raised voices outside. Sharp, angry, cutting through the morning calm like a blade. Fawn stiffened beside her, eyes wide, and before Sarah could sign a question, Dawn Willow burst through the flap, breath quick, face tense. "Do not go out," she warned, but her words came too late, because the moment Sarah's trembling fingers lifted the flap, she saw him. the broad, whiskey-soured man who had bruised her, standing at the edge of the camp with 2 ranch hands and a rifle slung over his shoulder, shouting threats at Red Hawk as if he owned the land beneath his boots. "Where is she?" he bellowed. "I know she's here. She's mine, and you savages have no right to keep her." Sarah's stomach dropped. Her breath tore loose from her chest, memories slamming into her with brutal force. Nights she'd woken to him kicking her awake for tasks she hadn't done fast enough. Days she'd been yanked by that same arm now gripping the rifle, the constant hiss of, "You're useless unless I tell you otherwise." Red Hawk took 1 step forward, spear braced in his hand, his voice low but carrying the warning of a storm. "You will not speak of her as property." The man spat at the ground. "She owes me rent, food, work. I kept her alive. And she ran from me? She don't talk. She don't listen. She barely works. She belongs where she was." Sarah flinched as if slapped. Red Hawk saw it, and something inside him snapped. "You kept her in a shed," he said, voice vibrating with fury. "You gave her bruises instead of shelter. You silenced her with fear." The man scoffed. "She's silent because she's broken." Sarah's breath hitched, her chest caving inward, but Red Hawk turned his head just enough for his voice to soften. "She is silent because men like you stole her voice." The ranch hands shifted nervously. They were starting to realize they were surrounded by warriors who did not fear rifles, men who had survived worse than 3 angry ranchers. But the man didn't back down. "Hand her over," he demanded, "or I'll drag her out myself." And before Red Hawk could speak, before anyone could stop her, Sarah stepped from behind the lodge, her entire body trembling, her hands shaking so violently she could barely keep them lifted. The man's eyes flared with triumph. "There she is." Red Hawk moved instantly, stepping in front of her, but Sarah tugged his arm, begging, pleading, not to fight, not to kill, not to let blood spill because of her. Her fingers curled against his wrist, small and shaking. Red Hawk looked down at her, really looked, and his fury eased just enough to hear the plea in her touch. She stepped forward, not past him, but beside him, her breathing shallow, her eyes burning with fear and something else. Something new. And with hands that trembled like leaves in a storm, Sarah finally signed. Slow, shaky, but unmistakably clear. "I am not yours." The man's face twisted, the ranch hands gasped, and Red Hawk's entire body shifted, not in anger this time, but in absolute, immovable resolve. As he stepped so close, the man had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "You heard her," Red Hawk said. "She chooses her own path now." The clearing went silent the instant Sarah's trembling hands finished signing the words she had never dared shape before. "I am not yours." And even the wind seemed to pause as Red Hawk stood like a wall beside her, his presence radiating a calm, lethal promise that she would not be touched again. The man who had bruised her blinked as if struck, his mouth twitching between disbelief and rage because she had never defied him, never stood beside another man, never looked at him with anything but fear, and the shift in her posture, small, fragile, yet undeniably firm, sent a ripple of unease through his spine. "You think waving your hands means anything?" he barked, trying to recover his authority. "Girl, you don't get to decide where you go." Sarah flinched but didn't step back. Her fingers shook as she repeated the sign, slower this time, clearer, each motion carved from years of swallowed pain. "Not yours." Red Hawk glanced down at her hands, and though his expression remained hard, the faintest flicker of pride warmed his eyes, because it wasn't his defense that mattered in this moment. It was hers. The man laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You got her brainwashed already?" He spat at Red Hawk. "She ain't got the sense to choose anything. She's half mute, half useless, and fully mine." Red Hawk didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift his spear. He simply stepped once toward the man, closing the distance with deliberate slowness, and said in a tone that froze the blood of every watching ranch hand, "Her silence is stronger than your shouting." The man's grip tightened on his rifle. Warriors around the camp shifted, preparing to move, but Red Hawk lifted one hand, a silent signal telling them to hold their ground. This was not a battle of weapons. It was a battle of truth. "You have two choices," Red Hawk said. "Leave now, or be carried away." The man sneered. "Or what? You'll kill me? In front of witnesses?" Red Hawk shook his head once. "I do not kill cowards who beat women. I let them live with shame." Something in the man's face cracked. He lunged. It was a mistake. Red Hawk deflected the grab with the ease of swatting aside brush, twisted the man's arm behind his back, and pressed him down into the dirt with one knee. Not enough to break bone, but enough to make the man gasp and choke on dust. "This is the last time your hand reaches for her," Red Hawk growled near his ear. "Touch her again, and you will not have hands left." The ranch hands scrambled to pull the man up once Red Hawk released him, dragging his furious, sputtering form toward the horses, while he screamed threats he no longer had the power to act upon. Sarah's knees nearly buckled the moment they were gone. Red Hawk turned instantly, catching her elbow before she collapsed. "Little one," he murmured, the storm fading from his voice. "You stood when you wanted to hide. You spoke without sound. You chose yourself." Sarah pressed both hands to her chest, breath trembling, signing with tiny, broken motions. I was scared. "Courage," Red Hawk said, brushing his thumb gently across her knuckles, "is standing anyway." For the first time, Sarah felt the words settle inside her, not as praise, but as truth. She wasn't a possession. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a woman trapped in someone else's shadow. She was someone who had finally, quietly, begun to rise. That evening, the Apache camp glowed with firelight and low voices, but Sarah could barely hear any of it over the pounding in her own chest as she sat just outside Dawn Willow's lodge, wrapped in a woven blanket that still carried the warmth of the women who had draped it over her. Every now and then she glanced toward the edge of the clearing where Red Hawk stood like a sentinel, broad shoulders outlined against the rising moon, arms folded, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign the man might return. She knew he wouldn't. Red Hawk had made that painfully clear. But years of flinching at footsteps, shrinking from raised voices, and bracing for the next blow had built walls inside her that didn't fall in a single day. Her fingers twitched restlessly against her blanket, wanting to sign something, anything, but unsure what to say. Dawn Willow approached with a clay bowl of warm broth and knelt beside her. "Eat," she encouraged, her voice soft. "Fear takes strength. You must put strength back." Sarah lifted the bowl with shaky hands and managed a sip, warmth spreading through her chest like something she'd forgotten how to recognize. When she set it down, she signed "thank you." Small, slow, but clear. Dawn Willow smiled gently, taking Sarah's hands between her own. "You have a strong heart," she said. "Even if your voice hides, your spirit does not." Sarah swallowed hard, tears threatening again. Not the sharp, panicked tears of earlier, but a soft, overwhelming ache she didn't know how to hold. She glanced again toward Red Hawk, then quickly looked away when he turned as if he felt her eyes. Dawn Willow followed her gaze, a knowing softness in her expression. "He stands there for you," she said quietly. "Not because you are weak, but because he saw your strength before you did." Sarah's breath trembled, her hands lifted slowly to sign, "Why?" Dawn Willow brushed a thumb across her cheek. "Because warriors recognize other survivors." Before Sarah could respond, a sudden rustle came from the tree line. She flinched so violently the bowl nearly spilled. Red Hawk was beside her in 2 long strides, his hand steadying her shoulder while his other reached instinctively for his spear. But instead of danger, a young boy burst from the brush, laughing breathlessly as he chased a runaway goat. The camp erupted in easy laughter. Sarah sagged forward, covering her face with trembling hands as embarrassment washed over her. Red Hawk knelt beside her, placing one large, warm hand on her wrist. "Do not apologize," he murmured. "Your body remembers danger. We will teach it safety." She lifted her head, eyes shining with tears that needed no translation. Red Hawk didn't wipe them away. He simply held her gaze, steady as earth. "You stood today," he said softly. "You spoke with your hands when your voice could not. And you faced the man who broke you without folding." Her breath shuddered. Her fingers rose slowly, carefully, forming the signs she had never dared show another person. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." Red Hawk's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something fierce and unshakable. He took both her hands in his. "Then you will not be," he vowed. "Not while I stand." And for the first time, the walls inside her didn't just tremble. They cracked. The next morning dawned soft and pale over the Apache camp. The sky brushed with pinks and golds that made the river glow like molten glass. And Sarah sat beside the embers of the fire, her hands curled around a cup of warmed sage tea Dawn Willow had given her. But her eyes were fixed on the tall figure standing at the edge of camp. Red Hawk, silent and watchful, his posture relaxed now that the night had passed without threat, yet still powerful enough that even the wind seemed to move around him with respect. She felt something tighten in her chest when he finally turned and met her gaze. Not out of fear, but something deeper, something raw and new, something she never expected to feel after years of being told she was worthless, voiceless, unwanted. She stood hesitantly, her blanket falling from her shoulders as she walked toward him on trembling legs, her hands already rising to sign words she had spent half the night shaping in her mind. Red Hawk turned fully, his expression softening the moment she stopped before him. "Little one," he murmured, "you slept?" Sarah nodded, then lifted her hands, slow, steady, purposeful this time. "I am not afraid of him anymore." Red Hawk's breath caught, barely audible. She continued, her fingers painting her truth in the air. "Because of you. Because this place feels safe. Because I feel alive." Her hands faltered at the last word, her cheeks warming, but Red Hawk stepped closer, lowering his head so he could see her hands clearly. "You made yourself safe," he said softly. "I only stood beside you." She shook her head, tears rising, her signs firm now. "You stood for me when no one else ever did." His jaw tightened, something fierce flickering across his eyes, and he reached out, slowly, with full permission to stop him, until his fingers brushed the back of her hand. "You deserve to be stood for," he murmured. "You deserve a life without shadows." Sarah swallowed hard, then formed the sign she feared most. "What happens now?" Red Hawk took a breath, heavy with meaning, and stepped back just enough to give her full space, not claiming, not demanding, simply offering. "Now," he said quietly, "you choose the path you walk. Not the man from the shed, not Eli, not fear, you." The world seemed to still. Sarah looked toward the river, toward the village that had embraced her without question, toward Dawn Willow and Fawn, who smiled softly from the fireside, then back at the warrior who had stepped forward when the whole world mocked her. Her hands rose again, trembling, not from fear, but from the gravity of what she was about to say. "I want to stay." Red Hawk's breath shook for the first time. He placed a hand over his heart in acknowledgement, then gently touched 2 fingers to her forehead, an Apache gesture of welcome, of acceptance, of protection freely given. "Then stay," he said, voice low and reverent. "Not as a burden, not as a stray, not as a silent shadow." He dipped his head until their foreheads nearly touched. "But as someone who has a place here, someone who has a home." Sarah closed her eyes as tears slipped free. Not of fear, but of release, of finally choosing herself instead of surviving in someone else's darkness. And as the morning sun spilled over the camp, Red Hawk stepped back only long enough to walk beside her. Never ahead, never behind. Because she was no longer a silent mail-order bride waiting for someone to claim her. She was a woman who had reclaimed her own life. A woman finally seen, finally safe, finally heard, even without a voice. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,